Now, as US oil prices topped $112 a barrel at over 7-year high levels, the United States and other member states of the International Energy Agency have now agreed to release 60 million barrels of oil reserves to compensate for supply disruptions following Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Tonight, I can announce the United States has worked with 30 other countries to release 60 million barrels of oil from reserves around the world. America will lead that effort, releasing 30 million barrels of our own strategic petroleum reserve. And we stand ready to do more if necessary, united with our allies.
Russian oil trade is in disarray after many nations impose sanctions on Russian companies, banks and individuals. Oil trade is exempt from sanctions, but buyers are now shunning Russian oil to avoid violating sanctions or any harsh sanctions that may come in the future. However, the news of the crude release did nothing to stop a rally on crude futures as investors priced in increasing disruption to supplies. Brent crude rose $7.6 per barrel to $112.63. That is the highest since 2014. The 60 million barrels represent 4% of the 1.5 million barrels of emergency stockpiles held by the IEA members. Half of the planned release will come from the United States, while the overall and the precise share of member countries in the release will be determined in the coming days. Now, the United States is responsible for about half of the world's strategic petroleum reserves. The other 29 IEA members, including the United Kingdom, Germany, Japan and Australia, are required to hold oil in emergency reserves equivalent to 90 days of the net oil imports. Japan has one of the largest reserves after China and the United States. And for more on this, joining us live from London is Jeevan Sandher, an economist at King's College London. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's start by talking of the impact of the Western sanctions on Russia. What is your assessment of the impact of these sanctions?
Well, these sanctions were designed to have a maximum impact on Russia whilst minimizing the impact to Western nations. And the Russian economy is subsequently in crisis. The ruble has crashed, inflation is rising, and fundamentally, Russia is a poorer nation today than it was before these sanctions were imposed.
All right. Now, the United States and other members states of the International Energy Agency have agreed to release 60 million barrels of oil reserves to compensate for supply disruptions. How effective do you think this move will be in filling the gaps?
Well, so far, obviously, oil prices are still rising. We're still seeing problems in the energy markets. Look, it will help a little bit, but the truth is, of course, Russia is a huge producer of both oil and particularly natural gas, the world's second largest producer. Any disruption from there will hit prices. Now, one kind of slight ray of hope in all of this is that given the sanctions that Russia is under at the moment, it's in every interest for them to export that gas, that oil, in order to get dollars inside their own country. And Western nations are trying to carve out an exemption there. So it looks like whilst prices are spiking now, there is a chance it comes down. Of course, on the other side, outweighed by either any actions Putin may choose to make or any destruction to infrastructure during this war.
All right, and you've touched on this earlier, but just for more clarity here, how do you assess the ripple effect of these sanctions on a whole going forward? Do you think Europe will be able to sustain its energy needs with Russia out of the equation?
Yes, so, I mean, on the kind of the good news for Western nations to some extent is that ironically, Putin since 2014, since he invaded Crimea, had been insulating his own economy from the Western economy. And so the direct impact of these sanctions isn't as great as would otherwise be the case. The intertwining is quite low. But on the energy prices, it's certainly true it could damage Europe. We heard the threat from Medvedev to double the gas price. That would be another increase in gas price in the UK, or electricity bills rather, of £1,000, another 3 percentage points on inflation. So it certainly could get quite bad, but so far it still looks like there is hope for the future and relatively less damage on Western nations.
All right, and also how do you assess the impact of this on Indian crude prices?
Well, look, India's subject to a worldwide market, as is everybody else, and therefore we're stuck in the same particular boat, really. Oil producers are going to do well at this point when oil prices are rising, and so therefore that's kind of, you know, the way things sit. The same thing is true of natural gas. Even if you don't buy gas or oil from Russia, you're still subject to a worldwide market.
All right. Mr. Sandhu, thank you so much for joining us with your assessment of the situation. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.